Welcome to the Nonfiction Writers, podcasting in a great way. I'm Ryan Aber, joined on the phone by Jason Kersey. We're here to preview the linebacker situation at Oklahoma for the 2015 season. Jason, how you doing today?
Yeah, doing good, man. What's up?
Oh, not a whole lot. Just been enjoying some downtime. You have, but OU football talk never ends, so we got to keep this thing going. We've talked about the offensive end. We've talked about the defensive line, but now it's time for linebackers. And there's a lot of intrigue at this position because of some shuffling around in the roster from last year. And I think the biggest key here, the biggest question mark here, is where does Frank Shannon fit back in with the linebackers after being suspended for the entirety of last season?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest linebacker question, that needs to be answered, and I think it's one of the biggest storylines on the whole defense, and that includes a defensive backfield that really has been struggling, but even with that, Frank Shannon still is one of the biggest stories, just because of the situation that caused him to miss last season, but also he's such a good player. We know that from the 2 years that he really played a lot for the Sooners. I remember 3 years ago, I guess, 2012, when he was a redshirt freshman, and OU was struggling so much against the pass because they didn't quite know what to do with their linebackers. Tom Wart was a pretty good run defender, but not a great pass defender. And they put Frank Shannon in there, and he really made a difference. And then we saw last 2013. The Sugar Bowl team, he was a leading tackler on the team, one of the best players that was coming back, and then obviously the whole situation happened that caused him to miss last season. But I think that Jordan Evans will start at that position, but I'm not 100% on that. I think Frank Shannon could start. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a decent chance that Frank Shannon starts. Jordan Evans showed some really good things last year. During his sophomore season. I think the biggest thing for him is just a continued show of consistency and being able to do it game in and game out and doing it in all situations. I think that's the biggest key that Frank Shannon has shown in the past. Now, the big question, though, is how does Frank Shannon react after a year away from football?
Yeah, not just a year away from football, in which he was accused of something that is obviously really bad. He's insisted that he didn't do it. He's sort of been, fairly or not, he's been painted with a brush, I think, by a lot of people, and that you never know how that's going to affect him. I mean, is that going to motivate him to come back and play really well and show people what he can do, or does that whole situation weigh on him so much that he's unable to perform at the same level? I think that's going to be really interesting, and really, I think that could go a long way toward determining how good this overall defense is, but more specifically, how good this linebacker group is.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The other intrigue with the linebackers, the other big intrigue is just how many of them are going to be used and in what situations with, the way that they've talked about going between a 3-man and a 4-man front on the defensive line. And, the amount of times that they have to use a nickelback, it could wind up being a situation like a couple years ago. I don't think it's going to be quite as extreme where linebackers pretty well disappear from the field altogether, but there could be less opportunity for those guys to find places to play.
Yeah, it's so interesting because during that 2012 season when they went to the, no linebackers or one linebacker on the field, it was a disaster, and I think everybody would agree that it was a disaster. And then the next year, they played really well on defense for the most part, with 3 and 4 linebackers on the field at all times. Last year, I think the biggest problem was the defensive backfield. Obviously, linebackers I don't think were that big of an issue. So I would hope that they wouldn't overreact to last year and think that they need to go back to a 4-man front or 2 linebackers, 1 linebacker. Just because of last season, because I think that could really hurt their run defense, and their run defense is actually really good. They need to shore up the defensive backfield, in my opinion. That's the main thing. I don't know that they need to be messing with scheme all that much, but it sounds like they might be.
Yeah, it does sound like they might be, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out because, like you said, the job that they did against the run, now there's some question over, well, did they do a really good job against the run, or was just because teams felt like they could pass it on them whenever they wanted to, so they were able to exploit that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. Definitely a fair point. It's kind of tough to know that when you're not on the inside. When you're looking at it from the outside, maybe tough to know. But I mostly just look at the 2013 season, and that's why I would guard against overreacting. To Mike Stoops has lost it. Well, 2 years ago he didn't look like he'd lost it. He looked like he had it.
Yeah, it's one of those "what have you done for me lately" kind of things, and everybody forgets the past other than what's right behind them. So,
I mean, that team last year. I know we're going to have a whole another podcast devoted to defensive backs, but I will just say that the team last year lost Gabe Lynn, who was really good at free safety, and Aaron Colvin, who wound up doing really good in the NFL last year as a rookie. So
yeah, coming directly off an ACL tear.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, we're going to have a whole podcast talk about that. I'm sorry, I'm getting us off track.
That's all right. Another one of the really intriguing players, and there's a lot of them at linebacker, is Dominique Alexander. He gets maligned quite a bit among OU fans and other people, but puts up good numbers. The question is, are those numbers a product of guys running right at him as much as they can because they can take advantage of him?
Yeah, and that's fair. I think he's a really good player, but I sort of see what people are saying. I remember I think it was his first start was the OU Texas game.
Yes, it was, filling in for Corey Nelson.
And he wound up with I can't remember how many tackles, but it was
18 tackles, something like that.
Yeah, but it was only because he was new and they were picking on him a little bit. But I think he's a really good player, and I think he's only going to get better. But I definitely can sort of see what people are saying about him, and he's obviously got to get better. I think everybody's got to get better, but I think people are maybe a little hard on him. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah, I think they are to some extent, but at the same time, I could see their points in some of the struggles that he's had in the past with bringing people down quickly and letting people break free a little bit. But certainly that's going to be something to watch with the Frank Shannon deal too, because he can play that position as well.
Yeah, well, I think with the thing that's so interesting is with a lot of these linebackers, Dominique Alexander, Jordan Evans, and Frank Shannon were all three guys who changed positions some in high school. Frank Shannon was kind of seen as, if I remember right, he was a guy who people thought could play safety at the college level, wound up being a linebacker. Dominique Alexander moved around a lot, was recruited as a safety to some other places. And then Jordan Evans moved around a lot, got bigger and everything. So, we're talking about three guys who, none of them were 100% linebackers when they were in high school. So they're all still sort of evolving, I think, as players, and they're getting bigger. And Jordan Evans talked a lot about trying to keep weight on over the last couple of years and how tough that's been. So, they're good players, but I think the biggest problem is OU's just not recruiting the guys who are pure linebackers, like they maybe have in the past, and I think a lot of people are wondering if they're going to get back to that.
Yeah, Jason, next, it's unbelievable to me, I'm not going to say unbelievable, but surprising. Here we are talking about linebackers, and we've got through about 10 minutes without bringing up a certain name. Eric Stryker.
Well, yeah. I think that's because he's about as solid as you've got, about as reliable and solid as you've got. So, he's not the first, honestly, not the first thing that comes to mind, even though he's arguably the best player on the team, best player on the defense. You just don't have to, he's not somebody that there's a whole lot to talk about, really. I don't think.
Yeah, looking at some comments though, after we posted our most important Sooners list over the last couple weeks, after you posted the striker post, I saw several people say, I read that post and looked at his numbers and had forgotten that his numbers were that good, because I think in some people's minds at least, I don't know if disappointment's the right word, but didn't put up the huge numbers that a lot of people expected, but he was still producing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I didn't even realize. I obviously think I follow the team pretty closely. I hope so. It's my job. But last spring when I was writing an Eric Striker story, an on-the-field one, not an off-the-field one, I looked at his numbers, and I was surprised to see that he had more sacks, more tackles for loss, all of those things than he did the year before. And part of that, I think, is because 3 of his sacks in 2013 came in the Sugar Bowl alone. So the lasting image of that season is going to be him harassing A.J. McCarron. So he had a more complete season, I think. But that's not to say that he's a finished product or that he's a perfect, great player or anything. I mean, this is a guy that still has some things to work on. I think he wants to get better in pass coverage. He's going to have to get better in pass coverage. I was rewatching the Russell Athletic Bowl a few weeks ago, and on that first touchdown that Clemson scored, Stryker really whiffed. When the guy went out for a little short pattern, I think it was him and Ahmad Thomas both completely whiffed on the guy. So as good as Stryker is, he's not perfect, and there's a lot that he can improve on. But yeah, he's kind of not the first guy that you think of when you're discussing the linebacker group, just because you pretty much know what you've got.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Now,
and then on the other side, you got Devontae Bond, who I think there are a lot more questions about.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to lead into. Devontae Bond is a guy who showed some flashes last year during his time on the field, and he's I don't know if we want to say an Eric Striker light, but he's got a lot of those same qualities, and he's sort of in that same mold. And also, Devontae Bond and Eric Striker are pretty well the only guys that Mike Stoops has to coach this year individually. Yeah. And he told us the last time we talked to him that it was sort of like coaching the same person. But do you see Devontae Bond taking a big step forward this year as a senior?
Well, I think he could. It's hard to say for sure, but I think that he could, because this is a guy, who was supposed to really do something last year early. I think people really thought, as a JUCO guy coming in, he was going to be able to contribute more. But that sort of discounts a couple of things. First, he was hurt in the preseason, and that hurt his ability to get on the field early. That hurt his ability to get on the field much early in the season. And then second of all, I think a lot of people forget that this guy had to sit an entire year out between his last year at junior college and his first year at OU. He had signed with Miami originally, had academic problems getting in, and so he had to sit out the entire 2013 season, getting himself ready. So that where he wasn't even practicing, with a team. So I'm sure that would have an effect too. But he's a talented guy, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe he's going to be capable of contributing. I think the question is, or the assumption might have been, if they were definitely going to stick with the 3-4, you'd have Striker and Bond out there together. Well, if you're going to go back to the 4-man front, is there much room for Devontae Bond? Or does he only come in when you're spelling Striker? And that, I could see that being a problem.
Well, and also, if they do that, do you just spell Striker when you got to bring in a guy like Okoronkwo?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's another good point. I mean, so where does that leave Devontae Bond? And obviously these coaches know a lot more about football than we do, so I'm sure they'll figure it out. But I think you got to have Striker and Devontae Bond involved pretty heavily in this defense if you're gonna keep things going, at least in the front seven, from how good they've been the last couple of years for the most part.
Yeah, but I've also think they've got to find a role for the guy that they call Obo, because of the job that he did just straight pass rushing last year when he got those situations where he could sort of just pin back his ears and get after it.
Yeah. I will say, though, as a member of the media, selfishly, I'm not too fired up about him getting involved a lot because that means I have to type his name a lot. But
no doubt about that. Copy and paste.
But I think I just have to do copy and paste or set up some sort of rule in Microsoft Word that when I type Obo, it corrects it to his full name or whatever. We can figure those things out. I don't think that's going to be at the top of Bob Stoops' list of concerns when he's putting together his defense. But maybe it should be. I don't know,
Something tells me that he's not going to think about us too much when he makes that decision. But you never know.
Yeah.
All right, Jason, other than the guys we've talked about, the guys that we feel pretty comfortable, barring injury, are going to be contributors at this linebacker spot, anybody else you see that can break through and make something happen and make a name for themselves?
Well, I mean, I think Ricky DeBerry and Arthur McGinnis, the two freshmen linebackers, are both going to have an opportunity to play some. And then beyond that, I think you have to look. Tay Evans and Curtis Bolton both redshirted last year, and those two guys might have an opportunity to play some too. Those would be the four names I would look at of all freshmen who I think could definitely contribute in some way, depending on how many linebackers they have out there. Now, if they only have two out linebackers out there at a time, I don't know how they're going to get the young guys involved. But those would be my guesses of people. But they're a little thin there behind that.
Yeah, and I think that's plenty of numbers if you use less than four during the course of a game, but you use four, all of a sudden that gets reasonably thin, but we'll see what happens. I agree with you on those. I really like Tay Evans. I think he's got a chance to be a really good player before long with some of the things that he showed during the spring, the size that he is, and really think he's going to be a good player. But it'll certainly be interesting to follow along what happens at this position because it's going to be so critical with what happens on the rest of the defense going into the 2015 season. But that's all the time we have for today. Speaking about linebackers, you can check us out every day at newsok.com and every morning in the Oklahoman for the best OU coverage anywhere.